What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the show. Today we have a Q&A episode, and I'm actually going to get through all of these questions and try something a little different in this episode, just from a recording perspective. My camera usually shuts off after like 30 minutes and has to be returned on, and so if that does happen, then I'm going to do that, and I'll edit it the best I can so it's nice and smooth. So we have some questions here, a little bit shorter, a little bit longer, but I'm going to get through all of them, and so stick with it. And so if you asked a question, I appreciate it. I picked, I think, the ones that I felt were the most helpful to the most people. I don't know, there's like 10 or 15 of those questions here, some a little bit longer, some a little bit shorter. So let's jump into it. First question is from Sage Sonig, and she asks, any downside to taking a week off for my deload? The answer is it depends. There are going to be upsides and downsides of different methods of deloads. I have an entire podcast on deloading. I think it's episode 100 is an update to my current thoughts on deloading. So I'll put that in the show notes, but you could just scroll back. It's episode 100. And it will go through this in a lot more detail. I actually am a fan of at least considering taking a week off for some people. I think the psychological benefits of taking a week off are underrated. I think more people could benefit from taking some time away from the gym in my experience of working with people and myself. Sometimes having that time back to just do other things, get away from the gym and almost miss it to a point where you feel more motivated to train when you come back can be very helpful. You know, physiologically, are there downsides? Maybe you lose a little bit of neurological efficiency. You might feel weaker when you get back to training than if you had done a more traditional deload where you train more than zero. You might lose some fluid, some glycogen, some fluid in the cell, and you might actually look a little flatter sometimes. I don't think a week is long enough to make any of that meaningful. Just has to be said that those things might happen. Definitely no muscle loss, like actual loss of muscle cell size, like actual loss of muscle tissue. That is not going to happen in a week, especially if you're at maintenance. So I wouldn't actually be worried about losing actual muscle. Maybe over the long term, slightly less optimal for long-term gains. That I think you would have to say that is the truth, that doing nothing is, if you did nothing all the time versus doing, more of a traditional deload where you'd have some form of small stimulative training, but, you lower volume or you lower intensity or you change the stimulus. Those are probably on the net balance, if you had to pick one or the other forever, probably better for gains over time. But you don't have to pick one forever. You can use, each of these tools, in an amount that helps you. And so I love doing this periodically. I find if a client is in a high state of fatigue, maybe very low motivation to train, just kind of feeling blah about training, or even if they're still excited to train, but they're feeling very physically fatigued, whether that's systemically or joint pain or chronic soreness, that some time away from the gym altogether can be really nice. And again, so we got to take this individually, but I think periodically doing this is totally fine. I even think she added some context of doing this I'm doing this back-to-back deloads. I don't think there's anything uniquely negative about doing it in back-to-back deloads. I would say that, on the spectrum of doing it every single time you deload, just taking a week off versus doing this a bit more sparingly when you think psychologically or physically you need it, maybe I lean a little bit more on that side, but I have clients who have made amazing progress. Every time the deload rolls around, they take a full week away from the gym. So is it going to inhibit you from making gains? No. Might it be psychologically what you need sometimes? Yes. And so again, I hate this term, but it's a tool in the toolbox, meaning it's something that you can use if you feel that that's something that's right for you in that moment. If you work with a coach, I'll be looking at some of those low motivation to train, how fatigued, when's the last time you did this? Are you going on vacation? Are there external factors that might make taking a week off easier? So I'll look at all that, and I think it's something that should absolutely be considered. If you want a longer discussion about all the ways you can deload and pros and cons of different methods, go check out episode 100. Definitely goes into it in more depth. Cool. Next question from Amber Jacobs, and some of these are longer entries, so I'm going to read them verbatim here, or not verbatim, depending on if I want to amend something. But she said, I'm 5 foot, petite frame. I was trying to get into a calorie deficit, but I didn't really begin to lose weight successfully until I dropped below 1,200 calories, and I didn't do that until the last 2 weeks of a 12-week cut that I had, or of a 12-week period of time that I had given myself to cut. I was making little to slow progress at 1,300. I only weigh 106 pounds, so she's 5 foot, 106 pounds. My question is, can you address smaller petite women like myself in terms of calorie deficit? Generally, there's this sentiment of don't drop below 1,200. That's a red flag. but I think that that's not geared towards someone like myself. I also work a desk job. I work out 4 to 5 times a week for an hour, but primarily sit the rest of the day. So based on everything I'm learning and observing about myself, I think it would be okay and safe for me to drop calories lower for a period of time. Thoughts? And yeah, I'm trying to get more movement in, evening walks, etc. So thank you, Amber. Great question. This like don't eat less than 1,200 crowd, like you should never eat less than 1,200 crowd. I think they're trying to do a nice thing, right? They're trying to encourage people not to do things that are overly extreme, that they might not necessarily have. They're trying to get people to not adopt a format of dieting that will likely lead to them not being successful in the long term. And I think for most people out there, if I had to give a very generalized blanket statement of, should people be dieting super aggressively or should people be dieting more moderately? I would have to say more moderately, but that doesn't mean there aren't people who are going to do great dieting more aggressively. Now, the added context that you give is that you're 5 foot, 106 pounds. And so going below 1,200 isn't aggressive for you, relatively speaking. It's hard to give very specific answers because if we were talking, if you were a one-on-one client, I'd know a bit more about you, how meticulously you're tracking, your step count, stuff like that. But if you weren't seeing fat loss at 1,300, I think without a ton of added context, I think generally speaking, I would be okay with you going lower. At this, because you are a mega tiny person and not insanely active. If you were like, hey, I'm 5'7", 190 pounds, and I'm eating 1,300, I'm not seeing progress, I would raise a more skeptical eyebrow of like, okay, maybe it's more of a human error thing here than, physiologically this is too many calories. Like it's very possible that 1,300, you might not see fat loss at that many calories. It is possible. And so I think you said, based on everything I'm learning and observing about myself, I think it'd be okay and safe for me to drop calories for a period of time. I think that as well. I think that would be a fine thing to consider doing. I would trust your biofeedback and the data. I would want to know about how you're feeling. If you're like, hey, I'm not mega uncomfortable, I'm not insanely hungry, I'm not insanely fatigued, and I'm not losing weight, well, then I would say you're not in a deficit, and you can go into a deficit if you so choose. If you were like, I'm feeling like shit, I'm mega hungry, my sleep sucks, I'm super irritable, and I'm not losing weight, we would have to have a slightly different discussion. But if you're like, hey, I feel good enough in this circumstance to lower calories in the pursuit of fat loss, but I'm feeling like the world is attacking me for going below a certain number, even though with the added context, I'm a super small person, relatively sedentary or at least not mega active, I think that that's okay, totally. I don't think that there's some red flag. So I think you were on the right track there. I had 2 thoughts while I was reading that, and I may overstep here, but it's my podcast and I'm going to say it. At 5 foot 106, you are not overweight. And that doesn't mean that people who are not overweight, and we can define what overweight even means. I'm going to use it in a very general term, not like in a BMI term, but weight loss for you is not about health at this point. My point is that you getting leaner is not you getting healthier at this point. So these are non-health related pursuits that we're talking about. So they're mostly aesthetic pursuits that you are discussing, that you're pursuing here. And I just want to be very clear that there's a difference between the conversation that we just had about you can do this versus, I would push you to do this. And I would just, if I'm you, just consider, like everybody should, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is getting even leaner at this point something that is worth paying the amount of discomfort you'd have to pay? Only you can tell, but I would hate for anybody to get to a point where they are sacrificing what might be their best life. And most people's best life is probably not losing, quote, the last few pounds and being shredded and having six-pack. Most people's best life is going to be a couple pounds above that with a couple hundred extra calories. And so just keep that in context. I guess that's more of a general statement for everybody. But in your context, I was like, this person's probably already pretty lean. And I would hate for you to fuck up your relationship with food and go into a place where you're, very uncomfortable for an amount of fat loss that might not bring you, a life that is better, let's say. And the second thing I wanted to say is just a general statement of like, this is why it's harder for smaller people to lose weight. And everything's relative, right? Like you going to, like the whole conversation we just had is that this 1,200 number is a different thing to you than it is to me. To you, it's a normal amount of calories, potentially given certain contexts. For me, it's obviously mega effing low. And so it's relative, me in a calorie deficit and you in a calorie deficit, we could be both in a 30% calorie deficit. And for both of us, we might be relatively the same amount of uncomfortable, same amount of fatigue, same amount of hunger. But in an absolute sense, you have an absolute number less calories than I do. And I see this when I diet with Jenna, and both of us are in a deficit. We might both be in a relatively similar size deficit, but I'm on 2,800, 2,500 calories, and she's on 1,700, 1,600 calories. Now, we might both be in a relatively similar size deficit relative to our maintenance calories, but it's easier for me because if we want to go out and have a burger, I can fit that in. Like, the world isn't made for you on 1,200 calories. Like, going out into the world and trying to eat on 1,200 calories, it's impossible. The average restaurant meal is like 1,500 calories. My point is, it's just going to be more difficult for you to navigate those circumstances where you're not cooking, because restaurants and takeout and all of that stuff is just so high in calories that in an absolute sense, it makes it more difficult for smaller people. Relatively, you're as uncomfortable as I am in that deficit, but in an absolute sense, if I am going out and I need to fit in a burger or something like that, like I have the absolute number to do that. And in some ways that makes it quite a bit easier. So just something I wanted to add there. Next question is from Caro Hod. I don't know, he or she asks, after years of restriction, is a year of reversing and maintenance enough of a base for an effective cut? Physiologically speaking, is a year at maintenance enough that physiologically you should be in a pretty good place to sustain a cut? I think so, yeah. What does it take to sustain a cut? I think being physiologically in a good place is a really good one. Some amount of like a prerequisite to deficiting is probably spending a good amount of time in abundance, whether that's a surplus or just eating enough where you're not in a deficit. So I think you're doing a good job here. I don't know if you'll be able to have an effective cut because it's more than just you. My point is, physiologically, I think you've checked that box. That's the question you're asking, is have I checked this physiological box of I've done the job where I've probably set my body up physiologically to handle a period of lower calories? I'd say probably yes. There's also the environmental factor. I mean, I don't know what your life is like. Maybe physiologically you can, from a I've been eating enough perspective, you're in a good place, but maybe your sleep sucks and you're going through a high stress state, and you're going through a breakup, you're moving or whatever it is. And so there are other factors that will go into this, like, do I suspect this person would be successful in a cut, or can your body handle being in a cut? I don't know. But this box, I think you have for sure checked. And if you think, okay, I've been eating a lot for a year, I've gone away from fat loss for a year, I feel, it's not just, I've been out of a cut for a year, I've been at maintenance. It's how do you feel? Like, you should be feeling invincible. Like, you should be feeling, in a state of abundance where you're not, obviously people are hungry all the time, like during all states of caloric intake. In a surplus, I still get hungry. But you should be feeling like, hey, I could live this way for the rest of my life. My sleep is good. My trade-offs that I need to make to enjoy my life are good. I'm not constantly thinking about food. I'm not wrestling with my relationship with food. What do those things look like? Now, I expect those to be in a decent place if you've been at maintenance for a year. But if they're not in a good place, then just saying I've been at maintenance for a year it's not being reflected in how you actually feel. So I would assess those things as well. Next question is from I am Mirithadas. Maybe that's it. Maybe I butchered it. How to know what phase I should be in right now after some yo-yo dieting I'm currently binging. I don't have a long answer to this. This is a very simple answer. The phase you should be in is not trying to lose weight. The phase you should be in is trying to feed your body and get to the point where I just named all those things where you're like, my relationship with food is in a good place, my biofeedback's good, I'm sleeping well, my energy levels are good, I'm not always constantly thinking about food, my training is going well. That's the phase you should be in right now. So whether that's maintenance or surplus, if I have a person who's yo-yo dieting, and then, part of yo-yo dieting is, let's say, binging, where you have periods of, I'm dieting and periods of I'm eating a lot more than I'd like to, I would probably look for some amount of sustainability is a weird word, but some sort of I'm thinking of yo-yo dieting, something that's very volatile, a lot of ups and downs. I would be looking for some sort of baseline. Get yourself to a baseline where you're like, hey, I'm consistently eating enough. I'm consistently feeling good before going into a period of giving yourself less than you need. So the answer is not cutting. That's the phase you should be in. Emma Hunter. I have limited weight. I have dumbbells at home. I prefer doing lengthened work before my shortened position work. i.e. doing squats before glute bridges, squats being a lengthened position, bridges being a short position. Because if I do the short work first, I feel like I could grind out loads for ages. My weights are still heavy enough so that things like squats and RDLs are hard, and I can get them close to fail. But I heard doing short position first is better for hypertrophy. So I have a couple thoughts when I read this question. The first thought was that I actually don't think your problem that you're having in your brain is actually a short position, lengthened position work. I think it's literally that the glute bridge or hip thrust, or whichever one of those you're doing, is an exercise where you can just do so much load that you don't have enough load to really do it without being pre-fatigued, without doing something else for the glutes. And so if you do RDLs and squats, then the amount of load that you need to challenge the glutes with glute bridges actually goes down because your glutes are so tired. So I don't actually think this is like a short position, lengthened position work. I think it's you basically saying, I can't do glute bridges first because I'm so fresh and I'm so strong in that state. I don't have the amount of load I would need to challenge the glutes in a glute bridge if I do them first. In that case, I love this. I wouldn't do the glute bridges first. I would do them later. If I have clients who, like if I'm programming something like a goblet squat, let's say, which you could argue is not optimal for hypertrophy because a lot of people are going to be limited by the amount of weight they can load, whether that's just like how wieldy it is, like being able to literally physically hold it, or their upper back musculature is the thing that fails because that weight is kind of pulling them forward. People would be like, hey, a goblet squat's suboptimal because you might not be bringing the quads close to failure. Quite often, most people, when they load weight in front of the body, are going to find that it's their ability to stay upright that is going to fail first. Now, I like programming some front-loaded work, a goblet squat, a dumbbell front squat, a barbell front squat, but I probably won't ever program it very early in the session. I will want the quads to be a little bit toasty so that you don't need as much load, which means you're probably less likely to have that sort of failure from, not being able to keep your spine in extension. Your upper back wants to round your core, whatever, fatigues first. And so I honestly don't think this order of exercises from short position to lengthened position. Like when we talk about exercise order, we have to look at several factors. When I'm putting together a workout, I'm not like, all the short position work first. And the rationale she's talking about is, if you do your short position work first, that's technically where our muscle will fatigue first. And you can probably go from short to lengthened and in the entirety of that workout, get a bit more high quality tension because when the short position fatigues, we can still work in more of a lengthened position. And so moving in that direction probably on the whole might give us a better result than doing the inverse. However, we have other factors we need to look at. Personally, I don't think short position to lengthened position is as important as some of these other factors. To me, I think a bit more about the neurological complexity. Like what is the quality of the work going to be if I put it in a certain order? Let's take you want to do leg extension and back squat. Back squat's about as neurologically complex as hypertrophy gets. And it's not as neurologically complex as like something for Olympic weightlifting, a clean, a jerk, whatever, anything like that, a snatch. But it's pretty neurologically complex for the average person who's not, 10 years into squatting. And so you might say, well, I got to do the short position work first, so I'm going to do the leg extension first, and then I'm going to do the back squat afterwards. I wouldn't do that. It's not that I wouldn't do it ever with anybody, but generally, I'm thinking about my group program. I wouldn't program that. Because I don't want your quads or your nervous system to be fatigued when you go into a movement like a squat. That when I say neurologically complex, I mean it takes a bit of coordination, let's say. And I don't want you to be tired when you have to do something that requires high amounts of coordination. And so I might sooner organize the exercises in order of most neurologically complex, let's say most technique heavy, so like squat, and then leg extension, because the leg extension is just a machine where you're just doing knee flexion extension and you can just sit down, grip it and rip it. I don't care how, fatigued you are, you can sit down in this machine and do this exercise. But imagine putting back squats last in your program when you've done 3 other exercises. Your back squat will suffer more than if we flipped those around because your nervous system will be a bit fatigued, your quads will be a bit fatigued, and you'll probably just generally perform. It's like if we if you were like a sniper, which is like highly, let's say, neurologically complex. It's not neurologically complex, but accuracy wise, like you probably wouldn't want to destroy this person's nervous system and then have them go shoot a sniper rifle, which they really need to focus on. And so the thing that you really need to focus on, in this case, the back squat, because it's more coordination or technique heavy, isn't something I want you to show up and do fatigued. And the second thing I would think about is, what do you care about more? What do you care about more, and what do you care about more should be placed earlier in the session, I think, generally speaking. So if you have a day where you're working, pecs and delts, but you're like, man, I'm really trying to hammer my pecs most effectively, that's the thing I want to grow the most, probably put the pec exercise first or before the delt exercise, potentially. Then I would also look at, which order of the exercises is going to impact. So if I put something first, is it going to negatively impact subsequent work more than the inverse? And that's a bit of a nuanced one, but you might look at something and be like, hip extension work into RDL. I find that hip extension is a short position exercise. RDL is a lengthened position exercise. And I used to put the hip extension first, totally. But I was finding that people were more often than not, without like really diving deep into the technique, were like, probably getting a little bit more lower back sensation than I wanted. But if they went into that hip extension feeling a bit fatigued from, let's say an RDL or a split squat or something like that, I found that because those glutes and hams were maybe a bit fatigued and the lower back probably feeling pretty good, they tended to get a little bit of a better stimulus than the inverse. And so there's a bit of a nuance here. I really don't think the short lengthened position is the number one component you should look at, but it is totally a one that is relevant. And if all else is equal, I'll go short to lengthened position. Let's say we get to an end of the workout and we're going to do 2 tricep exercises, and they're both very low neurological complexity. It's like both are cable work, let's say. I'll go short to lengthened. I think that makes perfect sense because there's no other contraindication that tells me that that this ordering would be bad. And so I think you're totally fine doing what you're doing, and hopefully that was some added context here. Next question is from Tanya Caruana, and she asks, can you explain what is meant by range of motion for the muscle versus range of motion for the exercise? I'll answer it in 2 ways. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by range of motion for the exercise, but Brian Borstein and I talk about this topic of resistance profile and training position, which is what I think you're getting at. We talk about that ad nauseum in my last podcast. Just go back 1 episode. So please go take a look. We dive into this a ton. I think what you mean is like range of motion of the muscle versus resistance profile of the exercise. And so the example I would give would be like a lateral raise. I'll give a couple examples. A lateral raise. So when you guys think about doing a lateral raise, most people think about stopping with their arms at 90 degrees, perpendicular to gravity, let's say, right? So 90 degrees, arms straight out. That's where most people generally stop their lateral raise. Now, a lateral raise, when we look at the resistance profile of a lateral raise, which is just to say, where is the lateral raise hardest and where is it easier? What does that curve of difficulty look like? Well, a lateral raise has what we would call an ascending resistance profile, meaning it gets harder as you go through that range of motion and stop at 90 degrees. So at the bottom of a lateral raise, there's no tension. Your arm is at your side. As you raise the arm up and it gets closer to perpendicular with gravity, there's more and more and more and more and more tension. There is the most tension when your arm is at 90 degrees perpendicular to gravity. And so you could say that this is hardest in the short position, or this has an ascending resistance profile. I think saying it's hardest in the short position would be a little bit technically not true, because when your arm is out 90 degrees, that is not the short position or the shortest position for the medial delt. And so a lateral raise is quote, hardest in the short position. It's actually hardest in the mid-range, because when your arm is perpendicular to gravity, that's actually more of like the mid-range, mid/short position for the medial delt. It's not the shortest position. If you wanted to train the medial delt in the shortest position, you would get the arm almost overhead in a Y-raise position. And so we have a difference between where is this exercise hard and what portion of this muscle's range of motion am I training. So if we look at a seated hamstring curl, where is that movement the hardest? Is it hardest at the top when your legs are straight out, or is it hardest at the bottom when you're in, a lot of knee flexion? It's hardest at the bottom for most machines. And so that you could say is hardest in the short position, and it is. But you could also say that you are training the hamstrings in a lengthened position, because when you are in a seated position and you are in, something like 90 degrees of hip flexion, that lengthens the hamstrings. And so we have this relationship between what is the position of the muscle, what position of the muscle am I training, and where is this exercise hardest? And again, if that's something that interests you, or if that just confused the hell out of you, go listen to the podcast with me and Brian. We did the first question I ask him. We break this down a ton. We talk about the difference between resistance profile and anatomical position and how they matter for hypertrophy or don't matter for hypertrophy. And so the range of motion for the muscle is like, okay, if I have my arm directly overhead in a Y raised position, that's the shortest position for the medial delt. And so if I stop halfway, that's probably the mid-range, and towards the bottom, that's the lengthened position. The range of motion for the exercise, I would think you were talking about resistance profile, is going to tell me where along that range of motion, or where along the range of motion of this movement, is it the hardest. And with those two, we can talk about, okay, what is the stimulus I'm getting from this movement? So if that made sense, I'm very happy. If it confused you a little bit, go and listen to that episode with Brian. We go into it in a bit more depth. Okay, next question is from Karina Moreno. She says, I like to add sets for more volume. Example, push-ups. I was only supposed to do 2 sets. I added a third after not performing like I had hoped on the previous set. I like to feel a pump at the end of the workout, and this helps me feel that. This is fun for me. Is this junk volume? I find I can recover for next workout. So I had a couple thoughts reading this question. The first was, I don't know. I'm not there exactly with you while this session is going on, so I'm going to take some leaps in trying to understand exactly what was happening, and so hopefully some of this sticks here. But generally speaking, you're actually not recovering for the next workout if your performance regresses, right? So if you're like, hey, I was supposed to get 10 on my second set, but I only got 9, or I got 10 last week, and this week I only got 8 or 9. If you regressed, that would be you, by definition, not recovering in time to warrant adding more sets to this. It might even warrant, either a deload or just some looking at the program. Obviously, we have to look at this in context. But, someone's like, hey, I'm recovering well from workout to workout, but my performance is regressing. It's like, those can't both be true. Actually, the best indication of recovery is your ability to progress. A lot of people are like, well, I'm not sore when I go into my workouts. That's not the only thing that has to recover. Sometimes it's nervous system fatigue. You might not be locally sore in the muscle, but when it comes to performance, systemically, when all the neurological things that go into you actually being able to lift the weight, those things can be fatigued from just generally globally doing a lot of hard work week to week. And so you might be like, yeah, I can recover for next workout. Like I go into that workout, I'm not sore. But then if you find that there's performance regression, that's usually like your Renaissance periodization would say something like you've reached your systemic MRV, meaning it's not like locally a muscle has been taken too far. You haven't overtrained a muscle, you've overtrained the system, and the system being, your nervous system's ability to actually push hard and lift this weight more than you did last time. So that's something to consider. Basically, a TLDR of that would be in the face of regression, performance regression, I would not add a set. Now, there's a bit of nuance to that because if you're later in the meso and you're finding that you're not progressing, or, you're progressing insanely slowly, let's say, which I guess in the insanely slowly, I might not add a set. But if you find that performance is good, but you're not actually beating yourself the last week or two, I don't think adding a set is the end of the world. And so I might I might die on this fence of if you're regressing, don't add a set. If you're matching previous weeks late in the meso and you find, deload is in a couple of weeks, and you find that you feel good, but you're just matching, you could add a set. That sometimes is one way to break through a plateau. So there's certainly some nuance there, but I would not think to myself, I regressed from my performance last week, so let's add a set this week. That wouldn't be something I would do. I think this idea of I'm recovering fine. Recovery and performance are intertwined. They are more or less synonymous. And if you're not able to perform at least as well as you did last time, you're not recovering in time. What else? You asked, is this junk, let's say. So let's move on from that and let's just have a more general discussion about what is junk. It's junk if it pushes you to this point where you can't recover. So let's say you did fine this week and you wanted to add a set and you added a set. And then the next week, you find that when you go into doing your push-ups and you're doing these 3 sets, you find that you regress in performance. And that could be from the fact that you added that set last week. It was just too much for you to recover from. So it's junk if it pushes you beyond the point from which you can recover. It's junk if it's outside of the hypertrophy rep range. If it's less than 5 reps, if it's more than 30 reps. It's technically not true. You still get hypertrophy from outside that rep range. It's just less efficient hypertrophy. And so we might just say, as a good rule of thumb, let's stay in that range. It's junk if it's not close enough to failure, which is not the circumstance here. I know you're taking this set, all the way to failure. You're trying as hard as you can to beat last week. But generally, junk volume, if it's not close enough to failure within, let's say, four or five reps, then basically it was work that you did that you get no hypertrophy for, which we're going to call junk. It's junk if you can tell the quality of work has diminished substantially and you lack that like neural drive. A lot of times, you might find, and this kind of goes hand in hand with taking the muscle close to failure, you might find late in the session, if your workouts are getting really long, that those last exercise or two, you're thinking about those sets and you're like, did I really take the muscle close to failure, or was the quality of the work just low and I got to a point where my mind stopped and I was like, I just can't do this anymore. The quality of work went down, the neural drive is low, the effort is low. You might think, oh, this feels hard, but you stopped the set before the actual muscle got close to failure because something else got close to failure. And so, those are some things that you might want to look at in case it's junk. It's tricky. If you're progressing, here's a very general rule. When someone is like, hey, Jordan, can I add this to your program? Or can I add this to my program? If you add that thing and you are able to progress week to week, again, not forever, but reasonably well for a number of weeks until it's a reasonable time to deload, and you are recovering enough to progress or at least match previous week's efforts, then I think that that's fine. It's not junk. You can go ahead and do that. I'll have someone who's like, hey, can I add deadlifts to your program? And I usually will say something like, if you add deadlifts to the program and you're still surviving this workout enough that you can progress on everything, great. It's just unlikely that will be the case. It's unlikely that you can add deadlifts to an already well-structured hypertrophy program and find that you can still progress on everything. Now, if somebody could, if they're like, hey, I added heavy deadlifts and I'm progressing on everything and I'm working close to failure and I feel great, that's awesome. And I don't have anything to say to that. That's fantastic. So when you think about, is this junk? Think to myself, in your context here, am I able to at least match what I did week to week? Or when I add this, do I find that next week I can't match what I did last week because I've just set myself up with work that I could not recover from? And now, it's a bit more nuanced than that because you might just be adding, you might not be recovering well enough from the totality of your training. It might not just be specifically locally the muscles worked in the push-up. It could just be systemically all of the work that you're doing. And it all, in some ways, especially systemically, goes into one bucket. Let me browse the question again. This is fun for me. Is it junk volume? I find I can recover. If you are recovering well enough for performance to at least match, if not beat, then by all means do it. If you're finding that you locally feel recovered, but when it comes to performance, you're like, well, I'm not really progressing and I feel like the quality of work isn't that great. But, in an attempt to, mitigate the annoyance of not beating what I did last week, I'm going to add a set so that I can do more. I don't know if that's something I would subscribe to. It may be very late in a meso when I have deload coming right up around the corner, and this idea of super compensation, this idea of temporarily overreaching, maybe. If it's happening early in the meso, hell no, though. I would be more conservative. Next question is from Jude, a bunch of E's. Would love your opinion on waist trainers. I think they're shit and a scam. They are shit and a scam. That's it. Anything else I want to say on that? Not really. That's it. Basically, just bullshit to steal your money. Cool. Next question is from 789 Kelly. Can you discuss what happens to muscle when we don't train for weeks or months? Yeah, sure. What happens to the muscle? First, what will happen is within a couple of weeks, you will lose glycogen and fluid in the cell. And so you might find that, we talked about that person taking a week off of their deload. Let's say you take 2 weeks off. You might find that when you look in the mirror after those 2 weeks, you look flat, you look smaller. You look maybe like you think you look like you've lost muscle. But losing muscle technically means like having the muscle cells shrink, like losing that muscle tissue. We're not losing muscle tissue in 1 to 2 weeks. You might lose some fluid in the cell, which makes you look flatter, probably, has something to do with a negative impact in performance, but you're not actually losing what matters most, the actual muscle tissue. That fluid is more transient, comes and goes. And so if you lost that fluid, you probably gain a bunch of that fluid back in the first couple workouts when you get back to training. That glycogen storage, just some of the other fluids that are in the muscle cell there, they're going to come back very quickly. And so just like they go away the quickest, they come back the quickest. Again, when people are like, oh, I feel like I lost muscle, I took 10 days off, you didn't lose muscle tissue. Everything that I'm saying now, you'll lose muscle faster, actual tissue size, and all the glycogen and this fluid in a deficit than in maintenance, and certainly in a surplus. Obviously, it will happen faster in a deficit, slower in maintenance, and slowest at surplus. But generally, these timelines are going to be relative to that nutrition intake, but relative to each other, that it's the same. And so, if you take 10 days off, you might look in the mirror and you're like, oh, there goes all my muscle. You just lost some glycogen, right? Your body's not storing as much carbohydrates in the muscle because you haven't told it that it needs to. When you train, you're telling your body, well, we're using some of this glycogen stuff, and so maybe we should store more of it. And when you store more glycogen, you also store water, and it can drastically change the way you look. But actually losing muscle tissue takes quite a bit of time, likely 3 to 4 weeks of inactivity or more sometimes, depending on circumstances, specifically nutrition status, enough calories, enough protein, stuff like that. Muscle cells will inevitably shrink. That's what happens. Muscle cells will inevitably shrink over time. Again, 3 to 4 weeks plus of inactivity, depending on nutrition status, but at some point muscle cells shrink. What's cool is that the actual nucleus, the myonuclei, myo meaning just like a prefix talking about muscle, nucleus, stays and it remains, and they're pretty permanent, frankly, almost permanent, I think we can say. And what that means is that when those myonuclei that you've created from years of lifting, they hang around. And so when you take time away from lifting and you come back to it, this is one of those reasons that muscle memory is a real thing, and you can actually gain muscle back much quicker, muscle that you've once had. And so muscle memory is totally a real thing. One of the big reasons is myonuclei, permanence, to some degree. Cool. Okay, we got time for some more here. Kesha Kagel, do you think someone can become a successful online coach without having in-person experience first? Absolutely yes. 100% yes. Do I think that there are things that you might benefit from? Do I think everybody would be a better coach if they also worked in person? Yes. But that's like a relative to the individual question. Do I think people can be great coaches without working with people in person first, or together alongside? Absolutely yes. I know a ton of amazing coaches that have never worked with somebody online, and I know a ton of not amazing coaches who have done it the right way and have coached people in person. So I don't think it's going to decide things either way. It's going to be way more about who you are, your work ethic, your compassion, your people skills, your continuing education, your willingness to work, just being there for the client. I mean, it's going to come way more down to who you are as a person. I think there's some cool, subtle nuances that come from having worked with a literal person in person. But I don't think that is the barrier to somebody being a successful coach at all. If you can get your hands on some people, your family, to, train in person together, a friend, just to kind of watch that person move in the gym, have those face-to-face discussions. Again, everything's digital now. I Zoom with all my clients. That's not the same, I guess, as being with them in the gym. But I have Zoom discussions with them. So there is some element of having to be able to have those interpersonal skills looking at somebody face-to-face. And so I think you can be a great coach without working with people in person. I think if you have the opportunities to do that, there's no downside. And so there's probably only upside. Emily, do burnout sets at the end of a workout do anything for hypertrophy? And we're going to reference some of that junk volume chat that we had in Karina's question a couple questions ago, but super broad. Here's what you need to know. We want to work the target muscle close to failure in the 5 to 30 rep range. There's some arguments for maybe not going that high, but let's keep it very general for right now. If you're doing that, which means taking the target muscle close to failure in the 5 to 30 rep range, it's going to cause hypertrophy. So you can right out of the gate say, well, my coach has me doing 20 walking lunges per side at the end of a workout as a burnout. They've called it a burnout. Is this a waste of time? I don't think so. If you're going to take the muscle close to failure at 20 reps, let's say for an example, walking lunges, which maybe there's some argument that that's going to be pretty cardiovascularly demanding, but whatever. It's going to be hypertrophic. It's going to build muscle. And you could layer on top of that if this isn't technically has to do with burnouts, but we need to have some element of pushing progression over time. And so If you have like random burnouts. So here's the deal. If your burnout is more than 30 reps, has no element of progression to it, meaning week to week, you're not actually trying to do a little bit more, you're not actually pushing those same exercises week to week, then I'd probably say it's more of a sensation-driven thing that your coach has put in, where it's like, this is going to make them feel good, which, to be honest, isn't the end of the world. If you really like doing this 60-rep booty band burnout or something, if you really like it, that's great. Just know that it's probably not as hypertrophic as some of the other stuff that you could be doing. So do anything for hypertrophy. If you want something to do something for hypertrophy, take a target muscle close to failure in under 30 reps. And then from there, try to progress over time. If your burnout does that, I mean, we can call anything a burnout. There's no like objective definition to burnout. If your burnout does that, then it's going to be it's going to be hypertrophic, not a waste of time. Angela Halverson asks, I'm going on my honeymoon in August. I'd like to cut beforehand. Do you think it's a good idea to transition to maintenance a little bit before that? I love this idea. I think it's a great idea. I think if you're going away on a trip, and whether that's the thing you're cutting for or not, if you know that towards the end of that cut, you're going on a trip, and in that trip, you're probably going to eat or drink more than normal, I might transition to maintenance a little bit before that, just like physiologically, the kind of person you are, the hunger levels that you have at the end of a cut are going to be less optimal for that scenario than you going into that trip feeling good already. And so not super complex. I think a week or two before that, going and transitioning, doing that reverse process, getting yourself back to an amount of calories where you feel really good, that person's probably going to have a better chance at enjoying their vacation instead of maybe taking things a little bit overboard. Angela had a second question. For a cut, would you advise tracking macros very closely, weighing in daily, doing photos twice a month, and measuring weekly? Listen, everybody is different. The amount of self-monitoring and quantification you're going to do is